Okay, so this is just some more practice with lecture 2. I'm just looking at it again, talking about it in a different way, and seeing it in a different way as well, in addition to your textbook. So same information, different format. This is a little bit more visual. So lecture 2 is all about neuromuscular junctions. Okay, so this is essentially what allows muscles to be controlled by your nervous system. It allows them to move because they are voluntary, so they have to be told by something to contract. You can probably guess what two pieces are part of a neuromuscular junction. It's a neuron and muscle. And then a junction is just a meeting place, so we'll take a look at that with a drawing. And neuromuscular junctions are formed when we have what's called a motor unit. Okay, so a motor unit consists of what's called a motor neuron. And you might have heard of neurons before, which are nerve cells, but when you add that word motor in front, all that we're referring to is that it's a neuron that's coming from the brain to another body part and actually alerting that body part. So it's the last neuron in that chain of neurons coming from the brain. So it's the motor neuron and the muscle fibers, which remember are just single muscle cells. It controls. So we're working here with nervous tissue and muscle tissue. Sorry, nervous tissue cells and muscle tissue cells. So let's just go underneath and just define what a motor is. A motor is something that converts one form of energy into mechanical energy. So mechanical energy allows some kind of motion or work to be performed. If you think about it like in a car, you have a motor or the engine, and it converts gas into mechanical energy. And in your body, we're actually working with electric energy or electrical energy with those neurons sending signals from your brain. And here at these motor units, we'll see that electrical energy turned into chemical energy or mechanical energy. So we're going to go ahead and draw a motor unit. And we are going to, I'm going to switch to pencil. We're going to start with the neuron itself, the motor neuron. And so I'm going to do like a quarter of my page on this picture and then a quarter of my page on a second picture. So just kind of focus up in this area. And the end of a neuron, or the middle part of a neuron, I should say, where the signal is being transferred through, looks kind of like a ring of sausages. You can draw that. And at the end, it has some branches, some pieces that branch off. And we'll go all into this in our nervous system unit. But for now, sausage links with branches. Notice how I am drawing these branches so that they line up with each line on my paper. That's for a reason. Okay. So this right here, this whole thing is called a motor neuron. So we have this part of our motor unit drawn. I'm just going to label this top part with that name, even though it is the whole thing, because we're going to draw some more stuff down here. And then down here, the second part is the muscle fibers. So we're going to add in those muscle fibers. Remember, these are individual muscle cells. And so there is multiple muscle fibers that we'll be drawing. Basically, we'll be drawing a fascicle, a bunch of muscle fibers, a bundle of them. So I'm just going to use the lines on my paper and draw my muscle fibers. Remember, muscle cells are long cells, so this all is one muscle cell, one muscle fiber. There's another one. Here's number 3 and number 4. Okay. Now, since these are muscle fibers or muscle cells, two key things that we want to make sure we have drawn to show these are skeletal muscle cells are that they have not just one, but lots of nuclei, which is pretty unique to cells. So I'm just going to draw some circles all over the place, showing these nuclei or nucleus are here. And there's more than one in each cell. Okay, so if this is one muscle fiber, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 nuclei in that one muscle fiber or one muscle cell. Another thing that we would want to draw in here is some striations, which are created by those Z lines, which are going to be our contracting units. And so if you look at muscle tissue under a microscope or skeletal muscle tissue, you would see these striations in those muscle cells. So we'll just add them in every so often. Okay, so I have 1, 2, 3, 4 muscle fibers. I'm just going to label one of those. Didn't mean to draw those dots. So that's one muscle fiber. And maybe in parentheses, I'll just write that there's 4 in this image to remind myself that this is a muscle fiber, not one of those. Okay, those are just those Z lines. So we should also label those as our Z lines, which are formed by actin. And then we'll label a nuclei too. Nucleus, a single one. Okay, so let's see what else we need to label. This entire thing with a muscle fiber and a motor neuron is a motor unit. So that will be a good thing to label next. Just box this all in. Motor unit. Okay, so now the title of this lecture is neuromuscular junction, which means where the motor neuron meets a muscle fiber. So here we're actually going to have 1, 2, 3, 4 neuromuscular junctions, 4 places where that motor neuron meets a muscle fiber, and 4 muscle fibers that it's meeting. So let's go ahead and zoom in on this bottom neuromuscular junction. Let me just draw like the zooming in lines. And I think I'll label this neuromuscular junction up here since there's not really anything in that area. Okay, again, a neuromuscular junction is where a neuron meets a muscle fiber. So there's one neuromuscular junction per muscle fiber. So we're going to start with drawing this little bulb-like structure here. It's called the synapse. And inside of this, we are going to, actually, you know what, we'll draw this first. So next we're going to draw the sarcolemma. The sarcolemma is the cell membrane. So this muscle fiber cell is surrounded by the sarcolemma. And so we're going to draw this like really zoomed in, nice and thick. And we'll just start by drawing right around here. That was too low, I'm sorry. Around here. Watch this, I'm going to leave a gap here. There is a gap between the neuron and the muscle fiber. It's the book had a really good analogy. It's like when you're talking on the phone, right? You're talking into the speaker on your phone, but your lips are not touching that portion of your phone. It's just traveling through the air. So this communication is going to happen through a little gap, just like there's that gap between your mouth and the phone speaker, or the phone, I don't know, whatever collects your voice on your phone. Okay. And so we're going to draw this sarcolemma nice and thick, even though it's a really thin layer. We're way zoomed in. I'm going to label this the sarcolemma. And if you tend to forget what the sarcolemma is, maybe in parentheses write cell membrane. This is the end of our motor neuron, so I'm going to label that so we can remember that's the portion here zoomed in. Now this spot right here, this spot on the sarcolemma that dips in like this has a special name. It's called a motor end plate. Every muscle fiber only has one motor end plate. Notice there's only one spot where a motor neuron connects. So we'll label that next. It's just the part of the sarcolemma where that motor neuron is going to communicate with. And then we have the synaptic cleft, which is this space in between. This gap does get a name because a lot actually happens in this gap. So we can label that the synaptic cleft. Okay, from there, in our sarcolemma, since this is part of a cell, we're going to draw a couple structures, reminding ourselves that underneath here is a bunch of nuclei, as we can see under here. We're also going to see lots of mitochondria, which is the powerhouse of the cell. You might remember from biology. This is where energy is transformed into a usable form. So we are going to have lots of mitochondria in muscle cells, specifically around the synaptic cleft, giving that muscle the energy it needs to contract. So those look something like this, a circle with a squiggly line. So we can draw some in our cell itself, and we can draw some up here in our neuron. Now another thing that's going to be in our motor neuron is a bunch of vesicles. So I'll just draw 3 of these synaptic vesicles, and in here are neurotransmitters. Specifically, we're focusing on the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. So I'm going to label one of these acetylcholine, ACH. Sorry, I flipped that around. ACH in a synaptic vesicle. Okay, so these are our synaptic vesicles. Those little dots are acetylcholine, that neurotransmitter. Now, neurons make neurotransmitters, and they store them there until they get a signal from the brain that comes through all these other neurons right to them, and it tells them to release these neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are found in your body doing many different things in addition to just moving your muscles and triggering your muscle to do work. They also can affect your feelings as well, a different type of neurotransmitter. For example, if people are depressed, it could be because you don't have enough of a neurotransmitter to create that happy feeling, and sometimes people have to take drugs to supplement that. So that's neurotransmitters. There's a bunch of different types. There's also some things called hormones that are similar in the ways they act or in sending signals, but a little bit different. So we'll look at that later in the year. However, what goes on here is that a neurotransmitter is going to be released when that signal comes through. So maybe we'll draw another one here, releasing that acetylcholine into the synaptic cleft. It travels across the synaptic cleft. It's going to bind onto the sarcolemma. When it binds onto the sarcolemma, it creates this signal, or it transfers this signal from the neuron to the muscle cell through the T tubules. This electrical signal will travel through those T tubules, and it will trigger the sarcoplasmic reticulum to release calcium and therefore the muscle to move. We'll be looking at how this calcium causes the muscle to move in our next lecture. But this is where we see that transformation of electrical energy into mechanical energy. So we have to keep drawing this a little bit. Right now, we just have the sarcolemma. We're going to look underneath it, and underneath it, what we would see is a bunch of myofibrils. So we'll just draw one myofibril. Again, we're way zoomed in. We made this really big, and so, basically, I just drew the sarcolemma. So if you think about, this pencil as being your muscle fiber, the muscle cell, the sarcolemma would be wrapped around it. Right? So if we cut through it this way, we're going to see this cross-section that we're looking at of the muscle fiber with sarcolemma on one side, and we're going to just show one of our many myofibrils on the inside. Now remember, myofibrils are made up of actin and myosin, and they have these contracting units from Z line to Z line. The whole point of this neurotransmitter crossing here is to get these sarcomeres to contract, so from Z line to Z line. So here we'll draw a Z line. Again, this is made of the thin filament actin. Okay, and maybe one more. And here's some more thin filament sticking off of it, more actin. And then in between here, we have that thick filament, myosin, which will eventually pull on this actin once it's stimulated by the calcium ions, which came from the stimulation from this neurotransmitter. Okay, so let's just write that down in bullets, maybe to the side. Actually, let's label this as our myofibril. This is one myofibril. There would then be some cytoplasm, another myofibril, and we just see these stacks of tubes of actin and myosin. We could even label the actin, myosin, and then we could label cytoplasm here. And then right underneath that, another myofibril will be placed there as well. So again, in bullets, maybe we'll write it to the side here or underneath, wherever you have space. Two key things. Acetylcholine binds to sarcolemma. This is what's going to happen at this neuromuscular junction. This is only after the brain has sent that signal through the neurons. Acetylcholine is released. It binds to the sarcolemma, and an electrical signal is sent through the T tubules, those transverse tubules. Now, as this electrical signal is traveling through these two tubules, it's going to trigger and triggers the sarcoplasmic reticulum, that web-like structures going all throughout the cell, all around those myofibrils, to release calcium. And now the muscle can contract. Again, we'll see next week in our next lecture how once this signal is sent, once this calcium is released, how these actin and myosin can work, how the actin and myosin can work together using that calcium signal to create this contraction in a muscle, shortening of our sarcomeres. So the last thing I want to just focus on is looking at a motor unit. This was the last part of your lecture notes. And so if you notice, we have our motor neuron. We have one motor neuron with a bunch of branches, and it can connect to many different muscle fibers, okay? Each muscle fiber only has one motor end plate. Each muscle fiber only connects to one neuron. However, each motor neuron, as you can see, can connect to many muscle fibers. Now, depending on the number of muscle fibers a single motor neuron connects to, we have different types of movements created. So if you think about like your lats, these are like the latissimus dorsi, those big muscles in your back, right around your scapula, you could feel them. These are like these really strong muscles back there, and they create really big movements. And this is created, or the movement of your lats is created by a single motor neuron with branches connected to about hundreds of muscle fibers. Not just 4 like here, but hundreds. Now, you can't just half stimulate a neuron. If this neuron gets a signal, every single muscle fiber it's connected to is going to contract at once. So all hundreds of those muscle fibers will contract in those lats when there's a signal sent from the brain. Now, if you have a motor unit that looks like this, where you have one motor neuron and it's only connected to like 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 or so muscle fibers, that's when you get those really precise movements, like in your eyes. If you look, take your eyes and go from side to side of the room, those really precise movements, or even writing, right? This is such a precise movement. There's no way your back could create muscle movements like this. They couldn't hold a pen. It couldn't write. But that's all created by these motor units with only small numbers of muscle fibers connected to a motor neuron. So we're going to just add that towards the end, kind of making sure you have it down correctly in your notes. So again, each muscle fiber, each muscle cell has only one motor end plate, while each motor neuron can have many muscle fibers attached. Okay. The other two things I just talked about. Oh, sorry, guys. So again, each muscle fiber has only one motor end plate. Muscle fiber, one motor end plate. But each motor neuron can have many muscle fibers attached. Each motor neuron can have many muscle fibers attached because of its many branches. The second thing we want to write is this, and I would even star this. Precise movements, and we can even write like where these would be found in your eyes, in your fingers, are created when there's few muscle fibers attached to one motor neuron. Whereas large movements, like in your lats, those big muscles in your body, there's going to be lots, like hundreds of muscle fibers attached to one motor neuron. All right, and that's it.